Hello, everybody. Welcome to CSAC's weekly research seminar. It's a real pleasure today to introduce this panel made up of several of our postdoctoral fellows. They'll be talking about uncertainty, risk, and responsibility, lessons from 3 technology. We'll have Daniel Greene, Maxime Polleri, and colleague Colin Garvey joining us. Dr. Garvey is having a little trouble logging in, so we'll see, we're hopefully able to join us by the end. They'll be speaking about 3 technologies that they've labeled as epoch-making, epochal technologies, and talking about the effects on the distribution of power and resources in society of technologies such as nuclear power, artificial intelligence, and synthetic biology. Our speakers, we'll start off with Dr. Daniel Greene, who is a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC, where he works with Dr. Megan Palmer on strategies for risk governance in biotechnology using computational social science methods. He received his PhD from Stanford University in the Graduate School of Education. We'll be followed by Dr. Maxime Polleri, who's a nuclear security postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC, an anthropologist by training. He received his doctorate at York University. He examines the governance of risk in the aftermath of technological disasters, particularly public and state responses to radioactive contamination after the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster. And Dr. Colin Garvey received his PhD at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He works on the impact of artificial intelligence, looking at cases from Japan and the United States. And he'll be looking at how to assess and manage the risk posed by artificial intelligence. So without much further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Greene to lead off with his portion of the talk. Just as a reminder, at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. So please go ahead and start queuing up your questions as you go. No need to wait until the speakers are done speaking. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Harold. Thanks for having me. So the introduction to this panel used this term epochal technologies, as Harold mentioned. And I've been thinking about why I think that the next generation of life sciences technologies will be epochal. And informally, I think about epochal technologies as having 2 defining qualities. The first is that they make some significant initial impact on the world. And then second, they maintain and reinforce that impact over time as a major technology for shaping world events. So they reinforce themselves. And I think that life science technologies fit both of those qualities well. And by life science technologies, I'm referring broadly to any technologies that help us to understand and to manipulate biological systems. So first, to speak to this idea of significant impact, life science technologies are already making a significant impact on the world, and they're on a clear trajectory to do much more. As many of you know, the potential benefits to humanity from understanding and manipulating biology are profound, and they range across many sectors of society. So I'll just briefly touch on 3. I'll talk about medicine, agriculture, and energy. So in medicine, life scientists are increasingly understanding pathways of disease and developing therapies that target different points in those pathways, like using the immune system to fight cancer, or targeting gene expression pathways for different kinds of genetic disorders. We're also, as you know, in a continual arms race with bacteria and viruses that have been threatening humankind throughout history. And so the life sciences provide us with research to develop vaccines and other kinds of treatments to stay ahead in that arms race. In agriculture and in energy, life scientists are working to develop a range of technologies that can reduce our environmental impact, like drought-resistant crops, more efficient kinds of biofuels, and synthetic meat that can be grown without need for industrial animal agriculture. Right now, the size of the current global bioeconomy is estimated to be at close to $1 trillion, and it's expected to continue to grow rapidly. But as I'm sure you also know, life science technologies, like many other technologies, can be used to create profound harms as well as benefits. In particular, they can be used to assemble or to enhance a pathogen that is then accidentally or deliberately used to sicken humans or other animals and to disrupt ecosystems and economies, potentially at a worldwide scale. As one obvious reference point for the scale of this potential damage, we can look at the unfolding impact of COVID-19 today, even though, to be clear, the current consensus is that COVID-19 was not constructed using life science technologies. Estimates of the financial impact of COVID-19 are still extremely rough, and they leave out massive amounts of human suffering and indirect effects that we still don't really understand. But one low estimate of the financial impact of COVID-19 is currently around $4 trillion. So that's already 4 times the size of the current bioeconomy number that I quoted. So the scale of COVID-19, I think, illustrates the devastating impact that biology has always been able to unleash, and that humanity is now increasingly able to summon and manipulate using life science technologies. So that's a little bit about the scale of what's at stake. But I think it's also interesting to consider this idea that life science technologies can maintain and reinforce their position in the world. Specifically, I think it's possible that if life science research directly or indirectly leads to some kind of public health crisis, that one of the best tools to address that crisis might be more life science research. And this is what makes life science technologies epochal to me. They have this recursive, self-sustaining quality. The more that you use them, the more that you risk creating new problems that require you to use them even more to clean them up. Let me give you 2 quick examples of that. The first is research on dangerous pathogens like COVID-19. So labs across the world right now are racing to understand how COVID-19 affects the body, how it's transmitted, how it might mutate, and how to develop treatments and vaccines for it. And this research is clearly essential for overcoming the pandemic, but it also requires sharing information about COVID-19, such as its genetic code, that could be used in the future to synthesize it or to make it more virulent or transmissible. And in the future, if life scientists contribute to the accidental or deliberate release of some other dangerous pathogen, they'll have all the more reason to invest even more into pathogen research to address that outbreak. So clearly, different kinds of pathogen research have different kinds of risk profiles. Not all pathogen research is equally risky. And it makes a lot of sense to look for pathways of pathogen research that are as safe as possible. But predicting the riskiness of novel research is both very difficult and also understudied as a domain in itself. So I think that there are no easy answers here. We need pathogen research, but we also bear risks when we do it. The second example I'd like to talk about is a technique known as a gene drive. And for those who don't know, a gene drive is a method of using tools from synthetic biology to modify the genes of a population of organisms so that a chosen trait gets passed on to more than 50% of that organism's offspring. 50% is the rough limit that gets enforced by classical Mendelian mechanisms of inheritance. So normally, new mutations in a population can have trouble spreading widely because this 50% bar can make it hard for them to get a foothold unless they have a strong adaptive advantage. But using a gene drive, you could potentially modify a small number of organisms, even a single organism, to spread its mutation with close to 100% probability to its offspring and its offspring's offspring, and so on. And that means that it would eventually drive that mutation through the entire population, across an entire ecosystem, or potentially even across the entire world if the organisms can reach that far. That's a profound scope and reach of impact. There are many potential positive applications of gene drives, but one that's particularly exciting is that gene drives could be used to create mosquitoes that are unable to carry malaria or other kinds of diseases. Malaria alone kills about 500,000 people per year and has a significant impact on economic development. And gene drives could be a real breakthrough in the fight against malaria and diseases like it. But the problem with gene drives is that once they're out of the box, you can't take them back. It's like pouring a colored dye into a pond, but in this case, the pond is the global gene pool and the dye is self-replicating. So clearly this has the potential to cause profound ecological impacts that are hard to predict depending on the nature of the mutation. The technological barriers to create gene drives are also going down every year. I asked a prominent gene drive researcher recently what was preventing amateur biologists a few years from now from hypothetically releasing their own modified organisms into the environment just on their own decision. His response was just, I hope they don't do it. And since you can't take a gene drive back once it's out, it might be that the best tool to counter the effects of an existing harmful gene drive would be a second gene drive or something like it. And I should note that gene drive developers are working on modifications to gene drives that can make them safer. For example, by programming the drive to kind of naturally disappear after a certain number of generations. But that's an added mechanism on top of an existing technology that's currently being developed. And I still worry about a world in which we're using gene drives to undo the effects of other gene drives. So in this picture that I'm painting, life science technologies are not just epochal, but we might even call them chaotic in the kind of mathematical sense. And by that I mean they have very unpredictable effects that are very dependent on initial conditions, because the consequences of how the technologies get used at one time point prompt the development of more of those technologies at another time point that have their own consequences. And that means that I think now is the time to think very, very carefully about what we can do to nudge the trajectory of life science technology development. I'll just close with a little bit about my own work. I mentioned this trajectory of life science technology development, and I think it's worth asking who's currently guiding this trajectory. So unlike nuclear technologies, for example, cutting edge life science technologies are relatively accessible to a broad range of people. They're in the hands of academics and lab staff, of engineers, for-profit biotech companies, and even DIY labs and hobbyists. Even high school students are already working with CRISPR-Cas9 systems. And these are ultimately, I think, the people who are collectively deciding what gets done in the life sciences, and they are the ones who set norms about what should get done. And we know very little about how much these people are aware of or concerned about the potential risks of their work. And we know even less about how to engage them to think more deeply about those risks and take responsibility for those risks. There's a gap between what I think we worry about in conversations like this one and in the day-to-day work that happens in labs that could potentially be sources of major risk. So I want to close that gap. My own background is in education research and social psychology, and I use those skills at CSAC with Dr. Megan Palmer, Dr. David Relman to design surveys, interviews, and secondary data analyses to understand the beliefs, the attitudes, and the norms around risk management in these life science communities. Eventually, we hope to develop programs that can create and shift norms in those communities so that we can move the trajectory of life science development to preserve the benefits while minimizing the risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Greene. I note that Dr. Garvey has joined us since the beginning of the panel. I just missed that fact while I was introducing everybody. So we will continue on to Dr. Maxime Polleri. Maxime, take it away.
Okay. So hello everyone. Just before starting, the speech I'm going to give today is based on an article that was published in a social study of design. So the preprint is already out if you're interested. So it took 3 minutes to reach my destination. And 3 minutes doesn't sound like much, but when you're trapped in a cage-like elevator descending 300 meters below the ground, time passes much slowly. And this is a journey that led me to the Tunnel Geoscience Center, a state-of-the-art research and development facility for the safe geological disposal of high-level radioactive waste. So situated in the small town of Mizunami in Japan, this project was led by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, a Japanese entity established in 2000 by the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. And the face of the technical advisor wore a clear expression of pride as he showed me the impressive and complex infrastructure required to dispose of nuclear waste. And the events that lead me to visit this nuclear geological disposal sites were a series of state-sponsored speeches entitled National Symposium on the Final Disposal Site of High-Level Radioactive Waste. And in one of these speech, the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry described the research and development that surrounded this technological project with a very proud voice, saying that Finland, for instance, has already done such successful waste repositories. We were told that we couldn't do this in Japan, but we have the scientific expertise to do so. So his presentation was not just a mere narrative, but also an assertion of Japan's technical prowess in the nuclear domain compared to other countries. But most of the vice minister enthusiasm came crashing down during the period of public questions that followed every symposium. Because indeed, the series of symposia had happened in a politically charged environment 5 years after the 2011 nuclear disaster. So the Fukushima nuclear disaster had led to the discharge of dangerous radioactive materials, as well as the evacuation of more than 160,000 people. The disaster also threw Japan's nuclear infrastructure into a mess of uncertainty, debunking the myth of nuclear safety that had prevailed until that point, while forcing elites to rethink the future of nuclear power. So indeed, after the disaster, nuclear power plants were shut down or suspended for safety inspections. And before 2011, Japan had 54 nuclear reactors, which provide roughly 30% of the nation's electricity. So an atmosphere of uncertainty surrounding both Fukushima's problem and the role of nuclear power in Japan was very tangible amidst the crowd that attended the symposia. So for instance, attendees expressed their discontent with geological project, arguing that it made no sense to focus on that since Japan was currently afflicted by an important problem of radioactive contamination caused by the disaster. So today I want to examine a set of public controversy surrounding the role of nuclear power and the threat of radioactive contamination in post-Fukushima Japan. And I argue that public controversies around the role of nuclear power and the threat of radioactive contaminations are being managed through a concept that I call post-political uncertainties. And this concept describes how specific categories of uncertainty can be produced and mobilized to foreclose political deliberations around controversial issues. So I examine how categories of uncertainty around specific political scenes, like energy security or global warming, gain supremacy over the uncertainties of radiation hazards, hereby foreclosing the expression of concern by members of the public. So for some state agencies, the potential uncertainties linking with the abandonment of nuclear power have the power to trigger political turmoil of a higher scale than those linked with Fukushima's radioactive contamination. So a form of double depoliticization takes place, where the issues of Fukushima's radioactive contamination gets depoliticized to perceive priorities that are paradoxically depicted as post-political, in an urgent need for immediate actions and not open to in-depth deliberation. So post-political uncertainties act as effective tools to manage controversies surrounding energies and toxic waste. And the concept aims to highlight how controversies around radioactive contamination have failed to become the subjects of public interrogation and political disputes within certain governmental spheres. So I draw my understanding of the notion of the post-political by the geographer Eric Swingidoo, who argued that the post-political moments replace debates and disagreement with a series of technologies of governing that fuse around consensus and agreement. So in other words, in a post-political moment, everything is politicized, but always in non-conflictual ways. Swingidoo himself drew heavily from the work of the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, who theorized politics as a process of dissensus, which confronts and establishes frameworks of perception, of thought, and actions. So in the context of Fukushima, this understanding of politics is very useful to explore how state and non-state actors mobilize particular ways of speaking, feeling, and talking about nuclear-related controversies. And in talking about uncertainties, it's important to mention that uncertainties don't just exist out there. They are also actively produced as part of strategic and ideological tactics. So different sources of uncertainties can be part of socio-technical risk or financial risk, for instance. So a quick word about my methods. So most of my empirical case study focuses on the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, which is Japan's most influential ministry. It is the heir to the former Ministry of International Trade and Industry, which was fundamental in cementing nuclear power in Japan, and in particular in creating what has been called the myth of absolute safety in Japan, where the possibility of nuclear disaster was perceived as being beyond assumption. So before Fukushima, the ministry also occupied a very ambivalent position because it was both promoting nuclear power while also being its safety regulator. Nowadays, the ministry no longer serves as the regulator, but it still remains one of the main governmental actors in the recovery process. So I have attended the Ministry Public Conference on the future of nuclear power in Japan, and in particular, a series of conferences given to the country that was called Japan Without Resources, a symposium toward the shape of our future energy. I've also interviewed state and non-state actors, and I've done that to examine how particular visions of nuclear power continue to affect the basis of expert authority to which state actors handle post-Fukushima controversies and their subsequent uncertainties. And what I did through my fieldwork was to pay close attention to the areas of uncertainty that are linked with specific imaginaries around nuclear power, highlighting how these uncertainties are ultimately framed in a post-political moment. So during my fieldwork, I realized that the ministry was mostly concerned with three forms of uncertainties after Fukushima. So the first uncertainty was linked with energy security. So according to the series of symposia, Fukushima had led to a decrease in the self-sufficiency rate of electrical resources, as well as a rise of power costs. So for instance, a policy coordinator argued that the deficit trade balance of Japan was horrible, and he claimed that the nation suffered from one of the highest level of dependence in its history. And given the long-term tense relations with neighboring Asian country, it was seen as unfit for Japan to depend on external supplies. So nuclear power was seen as providing a stable and Japanese-made energy and vision of the future. The second uncertainty was linked with technological innovation. So according to a professor of business administration invited during the conference, the decrease of electrical independence had led to a lack of international competition. As the men argue, if we continue in this way, Japan will lose much of its expertise to China. We are heaven behind Korea in terms of innovation. This was also very important in the research and development project that focused on safe geological disposal of high-level radioactive waste. Most of these projects end up being viable through a thriving Japanese nuclear industry, which was not the case after 2011. The third uncertainty was associated with the apparent increase in carbon dioxide. So after the disaster, the ministry could no longer play on the tropes of clean nuclear energy, so it had to resort on a different rhetoric, which is global warming. So in that regard, we were told that the emission of carbon dioxide had decreased dramatically due to the reliance on fossil fuels after Fukushima. So to counter these three uncertainties, a new energy policy was proposed to the public. And without much surprise, this is a policy that relies on an energy mix that aimed for a safe restart of nuclear power. So the narrative that I just described also highlights three specific elements of larger imaginary around nuclear power. So first, it demonstrates that for the Ministry of Economy, nuclear power is also more than electricity per se. It still stands as a perceived symbol of Japanese independence. So many of the speakers did not want to depict Japan as a nation that was saving energy, or worse, depending on other countries like China. So nuclear power was seen as a pillar in which a strong modern nation state should rest. Secondly, nuclear power also stood as a form of technological pride, wonder, and challenge. And the Japanese state has always embraced technology as a way to create and maintain a gap between himself and other countries. So for instance, in the pre-World War II Japan, the idiom wakanyosai, which translates as Japanese spirit and Western technique, was very popular. So while it's possible to argue that the electrical contribution of nuclear power is not necessarily a realistic energy baseload, the technological expertise linked with nuclear power was seen as essential to maintain for the ministry. Third, nuclear power also exemplifies a specific imaginary of a clear and present danger, which is best exemplified by the threat of global warming. And the point of importance is that these three elements rendered specific forms of uncertainty as being more important than others. So for instance, energy security over radiation hazards. And at the end of each conference, there was always a very heated period of question and answer where members of the public had the chance to interact with the expert panel. And while none of the presentations were designed to address the topic of radioactive hazards, the Q&A period was always a space of intense political debates where the audience tried to reframe the problem produced by the disaster, not around the politics of uncertain trade level, for instance, but around the threat of radioactive release, which many saw as imperiling the future of Japan. But these in-depth debates, which aim at challenging the framework of what could be discussed or not after Fukushima, were always unconventionally ignored by the panel of experts, which put forward energy security or global warming as issues that had to be dealt first and foremost, no matter what. And this makes lots of sense for the Ministry of Economy, because if radioactive contamination was depicted as more important political uncertainties, it will impede the reopening of the nuclear power plants across Japan, the research and development, and the economic policies previously highlighted. So against this prevention of the politicization of radioactive hazards, many citizens had found alternative political plane to express their frustration. And during my fieldwork, one important point of gathering was the anti-nuclear tent, which was a small wooden shack built near the bureaucratic office of the Ministry of Economy in Tokyo. So it was established as a means to protest nuclear power and the health danger of radioactive contamination after Fukushima. And as anti-nuclear activists, many members of the tent mobilized their own categories of uncertainty after Fukushima. So the uncertainties that demanded urgent action for them were not related to energy security, but rather associated with potential health hazard from radioactive exposure, ecological collapse from contamination, and the downfall of democracy throughout Japan. So both the Ministry of the Economy and the members of the tent were concerned by the uncertain path of a post-Fukushima Japan, but the categories of uncertainties that they mobilized to advance their political visions were utterly antagonistic. So what happened to the uncertainties put forward by this small anti-nuclear organization? How did the states reply to them? Well, geographer Swingidu argued that the post-political movements relies on either including everybody in a consensual pluralist order or on excluding radically those who position themselves outside of this consensus. So by resisting this road of a non-committal way, the members of the tent had positioned themselves outside of this consensus, which emphasizes safe restarts of nuclear power in Japan, thriving R&D agenda, and energy security. So state replies toward a member of the tent precisely echoed the post-political movement. Indeed, members belonging to the tents were facing a strategic lawsuit against public participation brought by the government. And when many people began to support the tent with financial donations, the government claimed that the members of the tent were illegally occupying private property, and they ordered the evacuation of the anti-nuclear tents, which was next to the office of the Ministry of Economy. So in the small hours of August 21, 2016, a bulldozer came and swiped the small barracks clean off the ground. So members of the public could rightly participate in discussing post-political nuclear controversies, as in the Q&A period of the ministry symposia, but they could only do so by following valid procedures of political participation, according to the states, which usually fell within the consensus that actors like the ministry had recognized as legitimate or not. So when public actors try to mobilize different uncertainties around nuclear policies or radiation harm, they face the real risk of being trapped in a post-political moment where less urgent uncertainties were depoliticized via means of bulldozers. So to conclude, the notion of post-political uncertainties highlights a different technique in the management of nuclear controversies. So rather than resorting to secrecy, as in the case of Chernobyl, for instance, the management of nuclear controversy through post-political uncertainties acts as a specific distribution of place, actors, and activities that all attempts to contain disruptive uncertainties. So this shows how nuclear controversies are managed in liberal democracy that nominally rely on public participation, but constrains them so that they are not disruptive. So in this way, political leaders encourage limited form of public participations as ends unto themselves, rather than as means for actually affecting policy. So democracy risks becoming mere public participation as opposed to true participation in actual decision making. So in the end, many scholars have argued that the nuclear safety myth was probably dead in Japan, a relic of the past, but I'm a bit uncertain about that. So myths are myths for a reason. They resist the test of time. They define ideal stereotypical cultures, and they create effective structures while being constantly reconfigured in response to the present societal needs. In this case, an economically and ecologically insecure Japan. So the regulatory capture of Japan might no longer be present in its nuclear infrastructure, but that doesn't mean that the specific Japanese imaginaries associated with nuclear power has simply vanished after Fukushima. It is instead taking new form and even mutating toward the rationalization of which controversies deserve sustained attention or not. So in this way, we could say that the nuclear safety myth is dead. Long live the nuclear safety myth. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Polleri. We'll turn now to Dr. Garvey. And just as a reminder to participants, feel free to go ahead and pose your questions via the Q&A. I'll read them out once we move to the Q&A session addressed to the various panelists. Dr. Garvey, please go ahead.
Well, thanks, Harold. And I've enjoyed Daniel and Maxime's talk, and have a little bit to add about my own research, which focuses on artificial intelligence because I see it as a microcosm of a lot of the major challenges facing technological civilization. And just as a kind of theoretical approach, I take a political decision theory view of artificial intelligence and try to hone in on how decision-making is being done about technological risks under three conditions: complexity, uncertainty, and disagreement, which I take to be inescapable conditions of decision-making in the, let's say, real world. And so what's going on with AI? As I'm sure you've heard, after falling into disrepute and failure in the late 1980s, AI has reemerged in the last 10 years to become a major source of socio-technical innovation in a number of domains. And this has been spurred by developments in three areas: big data, cloud computing, and especially machine learning, which cuts through a problem encountered in earlier periods of AI development by making it easier for programmers to allow machines to train themselves on sets of data. So machine learning has some downsides. It's very data intensive. You need a lot of data. And it's very compute intensive. You need big data centers. It's brittle, so it's still limited to specific domains that it's been trained on. So like faces, images of faces, or cats. And it's opaque. Once it's trained, the algorithms are black boxes and don't respond to much scrutiny. But it's led to big breakthroughs in a number of domains you've probably heard about: facial recognition, object recognition, speech recognition, superhuman performance in games like Go some forms of poker, and pretty good language translation, which has been a long-term goal of AI. So thanks to some of these successes, AI has been taken up into all kinds of domains, from internet search, every Google search is using AI, to criminal sentencing, social media feeds, the Facebook feed, the YouTube feed, all of these are done by machine learning now, to analysis of military surveillance via drone footage. And the widespread adoption of AI was driven largely by a focus on anticipated benefits. And as a consequence, potential risks have generally received less attention, despite some high-profile calls from some tech celebrities about takeover, which I'll say something in a minute about. But some of the risks are becoming more apparent in recent years, and this has led to a number of technoscientific controversies over AI. So in my research, I use a simple topology to map these controversies into 7 domains, okay? So first domain is military. So is AI going to make our soldiers safer by augmenting their battlefield capabilities or even replacing them altogether with autonomous lethal weapons? Or will AI start a new arms race that puts all of humanity at greater risk by increasing competition between great powers? Political domain. Is AI a threat to democracy? Or can it streamline bureaucracy and expand civil liberties? Does it have inherent authoritarian advantages, or can it be built with American values, as the Trump administration has claimed? Economic domain. You've probably heard about this a lot. Is AI going to take your job? Or will it usher in a world of abundance by freeing us from having to do dull, dirty, dangerous jobs and focus on more meaningful activity? Environmental domain is often overlooked. Open question, will driverless cars and other autonomous vehicles actually make our lived environment safer and cleaner, or dirtier and more dangerous? Can AI help the United Nations achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? Or will it amplify natural resource extraction and accelerate environmental destruction? Social domain. Will AI systems counterbalance our human foibles and make institutional decision-making more impartial? Or will it entrench biases and amplify racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination in institutions? There's psychophysiological controversies. Will AI augment our human potential? Or will it addict us to apps and infotainment in the attention economy? Big question right now, if AI will make us healthier and happier with personalized medicine and individualized dietary advice, or potentially exacerbate the ongoing epidemic of teen suicide and depression by seducing young people into spending more time on screens. And finally, there's an existential domain of risk that's under controversy. Simply, will AI bring utopia or dystopia? Is it our destiny to merge with AI systems and live happily forever inside some technological singularity? Or will super intelligent machines take over the earth and displace Homo sapiens as the dominant species? So these are 7 domains where there are active controversies over the impacts of AI, and these present wicked problems that I think demand our attention. But there are 3 barriers that I mentioned earlier to navigating the controversies. And so the first is complexity. AI is high technology. many actual and potential applications in many domains. There's no centralized authority over production. Our research and development is conducted in multiple areas, and AI systems are implemented in many more areas. And this introduction of AI systems into an already complex society raises the risk of unintended consequences, which we've seen when, for example, Microsoft's Tay chatbot quickly became a racist Nazi on Twitter. Unintended consequences. Second barrier is uncertainty. The socio-technical complexity of AI systems in society, once situated, means that no one has sufficient knowledge or expertise to adequately anticipate all possible outcomes. Okay. That said, there are good reasons to think the outcomes, for good or bad, will affect a non-trivial fraction of humanity, so big impacts. So as AI increases uncertainty in society, at the same time, research and development and implementation are accelerating. So the time for intervening to govern the risks is running out, or maybe the time is right. And last, there's a lot of disagreement around AI's impacts. So for all the 7 domains I mentioned, there are credible experts on both sides of each controversy. So actually a Pew report from 2017 showed that they interviewed 1,900 experts, and they were almost evenly divided over whether AI would, for example, destroy the economy or make it great again. So to summarize, adequately governing the risks of these controversial technologies like AI presents some serious wicked problems. There are barriers of complexity, uncertainty, and disagreement. But there's this logical fact that I think a lot of decision makers ignore, which is that to realize any large-scale, broad social benefits from AI, all the potential catastrophes have to be protected against. It really doesn't matter if you get personalized health advice if you know, killer robots are running wild. So how do we make intelligent decisions and craft wise policy despite these barriers of complexity, uncertainty, and disagreement? And in my work, I draw on political decision theory to take a strategic approach. And I would contrast that with what I would call an analytic approach. So a purely analytic approach is kind of what's being adopted by an area called AI ethics right now. And this is from rational decision theory to examine the world, the state of the world in light of a set of values, propose alternative states that would be more desirable in light of those values, use the values to rank the alternative states, propose policies to achieve the desired states, rank the policies in light of the values. And this sounds good on paper, but in fact is impossible in practice. There's dozens, maybe 100 or so sets of AI ethics principles that have been released by everyone from the Department of Defense to the Pope, actually. And the first problem is that lists of principles don't offer much good advice for handling conflicts between values. So to name 3 very popular values, fairness, accountability, and transparency in AI, a policy that increased transparency might negatively impact fairness. And without any further guidance, it's not clear how to resolve that conflict. So a strategic approach understands that the rational approach is impossible in practice and takes a few heuristics to cut through the analytic problem to make decisions. And we're familiar with this from everyday life. Sometimes we flip a coin to decide what to do instead of laboriously analyzing all the possibilities. That's pretty simple. You might, like I do, throw the I Ching or consult an oracle. That's another strategy. But some other strategies are using historical analogies. So in my research, I look at other epochal technologies. Thanks for introducing that, Dan. Like nuclear power, genetic engineering, synthetic chemicals. And I ask, in those cases, given that catastrophes could have occurred, why didn't they? And what went right? Can we apply that to AI? And so I have 5 strategies that I use in a framework, and I'll just quickly run through them. The first is deliberation. Deliberating risks with more and different people is a strategy for surfacing potential unintended consequences and other risks, right? And this has the advantage of potentially being scalable, right? So would-be victims of a controversial technology, if they were brought in to the decision-making table to deliberate, might have some interesting things to say about potential risks. This happened in the, for example, Asilomar conferences about genetic engineering in the 70s. A second one is pluralistic decision-making. We know this as checks and balances or separation of powers. We use this in democratic governance all the time because authority wielded without checks is potentially dangerous. We'll try to wrap it up quickly here. Next one is prudence. This is the most obvious, but using stringent initial precautions when dealing with a dangerous technology. And so I'm always surprised to dig into AI projects and find out that no precautions were taken in the development of the systems. And testing for risks is not an established practice as yet in the AI industry. Fourth strategy, preparation for trial and error learning. Knowing that society and technology are too complex to fully anticipate perfectly with any analysis, the best we can do is to prepare to learn from errors. That requires monitoring and feedback, and then action, incentives on the part of decision makers to fix errors. And I'm just going to say the ongoing controversies around Facebook and their AI powered system show how errors, even when identified, don't always get corrected when there aren't sufficient incentives. And last, appropriate expertise. Because no one has sufficient knowledge or expertise of AI impacts to fully understand them, and technical expertise that creates the systems is probably insufficient to fully anticipate the consequences of introducing them to society, renegotiating the mix of experts, let's say, in the room for decision-making is one powerful, potentially powerful strategy for changing the direction of, or governing the risks more successfully. And so I'll just wrap it up there and say I'm working on my book right now where I use this framework, the 5 strategies, each of which has 4 tactics to ask a game of 20 questions about AI and say, well, we're not doing this, but we know this is a pretty good strategy, so we could try it. And thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Garvey. I'll go ahead and move towards Q&A. Please remember to enter any questions you might have in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I'll be reading the questions one by one. I'll start off with a question from Melissa Griffith. This one is addressed to Daniel Greene. She says, you concluded your talk with a discussion of the gap between the day-to-day operations of the life science community and risk assessment discussions and model development happening in forums like this. Could you speak a bit to the division of roles and responsibilities you're observing within the life sciences given this gap? On the one hand, you have a bottom-up approach you mentioned and advocated for where life science communities themselves are further educated on risk and then embed that awareness in their own decisions. On the other hand, you have a more top-down approach to risk management where responsibility for establishing best practices and regulations lies with organizations and governments not embedded in the day-to-day operations. What is your thought on the risk assessment roles and responsibilities you're currently observing, and what would you prefer to see as a mix going forward?
Yeah, thanks. I see a set of top-down regulations and standards that attempt to manage some of the risks of life science technologies, but the risks of those standards or the problems with those standards is that they can rapidly become out of date as life science technologies develop. So for example, the United States has a policy around so-called dual-use research of concern, research that can be used potentially for benefit or harm and has a sort of imminent risk to be used for one or the other. And there are standards for such research to get reviewed by a panel to assess the risks that might come from publishing such research. The definitions of dual-use research of concern is a very contentious definition. It's difficult to define, and the definitions have historically focused on particular organisms that are pathogenic or particular compounds or toxins, and it's relatively easy to make a list of such compounds and toxins and organisms, but synthetic biology is giving life scientists the ability to modify the genomes of otherwise innocuous organisms to create unintended consequences. So it becomes much more difficult to create such lists. And so I think that poses a challenge to top-down regulatory approaches. I think there's still an important role for them for catching a lot of the use cases, but I agree with what Colin said about the idea of sort of adaptive feedback-driven regulatory systems that can learn more quickly about the new emerging instances of risk. One example of this that gets raised frequently in the biological risk community is the iGEM Foundation. So iGEM is an annual synthetic biology competition where teams of mostly high school and college students submit projects to compete for awards. It's sort of a funnel for the future life science community and synthetic biology community. And the Safety and Security Committee at iGEM is really they're kind of at the cutting edge or the vanguard of thinking about novel risk concerns, because they're faced with these new projects and they have to update their standards year by year and address things on a case-by-case basis. So they're situated in such a way that they are challenged to update their policies very quickly. And then so in terms of bottom-up approaches, I did talk about things like norms in my talk, and I think that, as I mentioned, there are efforts to cultivate norms and to quote unquote educate or train life scientists around ethics and sort of managing risks of their research. I think that those education efforts have a lot of flaws, which is a lot to get into, but I think that there's a great deal of room for improvement in the cultivation of norms and responsibility in the life sciences that would not have to compete with top-down regulatory approaches. And then I think maybe a third element that is complementary to both of those is the establishment of clearer incentives for risk management among life scientists. So things like publication opportunities or funding opportunities for life scientists who are taking certain kinds of risk assessment or risk management best practices that are recognized in the biorisk community. So I think that also maybe addresses one of the other questions around policy recommendations. That's sort of one policy recommendation I might support is like is the kind of promotion of arrangements with funders and journals for support for risk management practices in life sciences.
Thank you, Daniel. I have the next question is from Sig Hecker, and it's followed by a question from Gabriel Hecht. So Sig Hecker asks Maxime, you correctly pointed out the conflict of interest that MIT had in promoting nuclear power while also regulating nuclear power. It came under scathing criticism in the National Diet Independent Commission in 2012, as did the rest of the nuclear industry and the government organizations related to it. Did this report have a lasting positive effect on many of the issues and concerns you presented, or is it back to business as usual again in Japan?
Yes, so the quick answer is yes and no. I've interviewed a man that was in charge of the independent commission, and this was basically ordered by the Democratic Party of Japan. But when the independent commission was ended, there was a change of political party in Japan, and it went back to the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, which is much more conservative, a little bit right-wing, and also very much pro-nuclear. So for this man, a lot of the independent report was what he called a kabuki theater. So it was done mostly only for the form. However, it did lead to some change. So for instance, METI is no longer linked with being a regulator of the nuclear power industry. So it led to the creation of the Nuclear Regulation Authority, which is now in charge of regulating nuclear power in Japan. So this is supposed to be an independent agency. However, you have a lot of people, a lot of experts from the former safety agency that moved back to this newly agency. So they still come with their same imaginaries. They still come with some of their same ways of handling nuclear power. So to what extent is this an aesthetic change? It's still a harsh question. From my point of view, I think it seems to be mostly a little bit business as usual. So there's micro scale change, but the big picture seems to be back to normal. So let's restart nuclear power as soon as we can.
Thank you, Maxime. The next question is from Gabriel Hecht, and that will be followed by a question from Maria Grinberg. Gabrielle's question is for Daniel and Colin. It's based on some of the thoughts that Maxime introduced in his talk. She says, Maxime argues that the generic language of uncertainty can be deployed to render otherwise incommensurable risks commensurable. For example, energy risk, financial risk, health risk, in order to create a hierarchy of urgency, which in turn serves to depoliticize debates. I'd add that the language of security gets deployed in a similar way. So the question to Daniel and to Colin is, do you see these dynamics unfolding in your research? And to all, so this is back to including Maxime, how can this insight about using uncertainty and security to create hierarchies of urgency and depoliticize debates help us make sense of the current COVID-19 crisis? So Daniel, Colin, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, am I on? Yeah. So I see this quite a bit. That's actually, I mean, thanks to Maria, of course, for having a beautifully phrased question. The hierarchy of urgency definitely is used in security conversations around AI, and you may be familiar with the growing talk of an AI arms race between the United States and China. And so in this case, the post-political uncertainty aspect comes in that we don't really know what China's doing with military AI, but everyone can agree we have to beat them at AI. So the National Security Commission on AI right now is framing their entire report this way, and arguing that more military funding for AI is an urgent necessity to maintain American leadership. But the connection between AI funding and increased security or improved strategic stability, or even a stronger military at all, is not clear or established in any conclusive way. And my historical work on the first AI arms race of the 1980s shows that the largest national AI project the United States had ever launched, the Strategic Computing Initiative that ran from 1983 to 1993, was just short of being a total failure that contributed very little to America's standing globally. So yeah, good connection there. As far as COVID-19, I'll have to think about that.
And to clarify, that question is from Gabrielle Hecht.
Sorry.
So Daniel, do you want to say something, or Maxime? Daniel?
Sure. I think one clear instance of, potentially commensurable risks that we're juggling at the same time during the COVID-19 crisis is the economic risks of quarantine lockdown compared to the health and other risks of raising the lockdown. And there are very live debates happening right now across the country and in different areas about the trade-offs across those different sorts of risks. And I'm not in a position to offer strong positions one side or the other. I think they're difficult judgment calls to be made, and there's sort of international experiments being run, you might say, looking at different trade-offs on when and how to lift quarantine lockdowns. I think that I guess I see instances of those sort of that juggling of risks not becoming depoliticized but becoming hyper-politicized, where different political sides will downplay one form of risk or the other, will downplay economic risks by saying, oh, why, do you just care about the economy when there are human lives at stake, while of course the economy affects human lives, so it's not really a one or the other choice. I think that I think another instance of politicization comes around the ongoing debates around the origins of COVID-19. There's still uncertainty around where it's come from. There's a New York Times article that just came out today, headline, "Trump officials are said to press spies to link virus and Wuhan labs." So there's an ongoing effort to understand and interpret and frame the current pandemic crisis in different ways for political efforts. I think that there are, underneath that, there are sort of relatively stable sources of risk that we've already known have been an issue, and that we can, in some sense, that it's important to keep our eyes on the ball in terms of understanding that we've always known about the risks of natural pandemics. We've always known, not always, but we've known for quite a while about the risks of outbreaks that could come from laboratories, accidental or deliberate. We may never know the origin of COVID-19, and it's important to act under uncertainty about that, with a focus towards mitigating both sources of risk and other potential sources of risk.
Thank you. And Maxime, if you could just briefly a comment on the COVID-19.
Yeah, so I'll be super brief. I've wrote a little piece in the University College London Medical Anthropology, which is called Thinking Ahead on Post-COVID-19 Vulnerabilities, and it's tackled some of these questions. So I'll direct you toward this piece. It's going to be quicker. Thank you.
Good, and maybe we can even distribute that afterwards. So next question from Maria Grinberg. Humanity has been developing technology that had the potential for massive destruction for most of that history. Granted, the scale has increased over time. How have the kinds of risks you've all discussed been handled in the past, and can similar solutions work now? Colin, I know you referred to that a bit, so maybe we'll start with, actually, let's see if Maxime or Daniel, do you want to jump in, or do you want to let Colin lead off?
Either way, I have some thoughts, but happy for Colin to go if you want.
So Daniel, it looks like people are ceding the floor to you.
All right, cool. So I was thinking about this question. I think there are in some ways in which biological risks have, particularly large-scale disastrous biological risks, have become more concerning over time in ways in which they've become less concerning over time. On the one hand, they become more concerning over time insofar as we are a more networked society, and diseases can spread at a greater distance more quickly. I think we're also advancing industrial agriculture into areas with wild animals more than we have done before. And that is also exposing us to a kind of frontier of viruses that are carried in animals and could potentially hop over to humans. I think that the degree to which we are packed together in cities is another potential source of risk. And I think there's some ways in which we're safer. Obviously, our medical technologies have improved. In some ways, the degree to which we're networked is might make the average disease spread more widely, but also potentially reduces the chance that a single population is totally unexposed to a given disease and then is hit extra hard if it ever reaches them. So as I understand it, that's something like what happened in the Americas when smallpox and other diseases were carried by colonizers from Europe to the Americas, and they were basically caught off guard by these diseases that had been circulating in other continents, and the results were absolutely disastrous. In terms of mitigation efforts, some of the efforts we're doing now are sort of time-honored public health strategies of quarantine and social distancing. We are racing to develop new vaccines, as I mentioned, with technologies that haven't existed in the past. There's a potential for broad spectrum antiviral technologies that are sort of an exciting direction of research. I think those are the issues that come to mind for me in terms of ways that we've mitigated these sorts of risks in the past.
Colin, do you want to say something next, and then
sure.
maybe see?
Yeah, I just had a few more thoughts that from different areas. So one thought, and it's not a weapon per se, but toxic chemicals, development of which really took off after World War I, but also especially World War II. There's like 100,000 new synthetic chemicals in our environment, in our blood, everywhere. One approach to governance that the United States tried was the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1973. And this required pre-manufacture notification to the EPA of all new substances. And so the idea was the EPA would then review the substance for potential harm, prioritize the most harmful, do the testing, and then issue a manufacturer an authorization to proceed or not. In implementation, manufacturers quickly overwhelmed the resources of the EPA with the number and diversity of substances they're producing. So the EPA still has only tested a few hundred of the over 100,000 chemicals that have been created. But I could imagine something similar for AI, like a Toxic Algorithms Control Act that would require at least pre-release notification, and then potentially something like a FDA, Food and Drug Administration type agency for conducting tests on social impacts, other impacts of new algorithms. And of course, none of this exists now, but it's one potential model. I'll throw one more thought in there. As far as precautions, the difference between 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl in terms of nuclear disasters was determined by a containment vessel. American engineers, were proud of their work, but still built a containment vessel around the reactor at TMI. Whereas it's arguable the Russian engineers were confident of their powers and did not, resulting in huge releases of toxic nuclear substances. Similar precautions could be taken in mission critical artificial intelligence applications, especially if they're going to be integrated into NC3 control systems or making lethal decisions on a battlefield. And last, insurance industry. Getting insurance for a nuclear power plant was so expensive that the government had to subsidize the industry and waive requirements, right? There's currently no insurance for artificial intelligence right now, but if we rephrased insurance as victim compensation funds, this could be required for something like this new Apple-Google collaboration contactless tracing app. So if a manufacturer is going to receive a contract to produce something like that, they might also be required to set aside a certain amount of money to compensate potential victims of identity theft, other abuses that might arise from that new AI system. And all of these steps would also have the second order benefit of potentially slowing innovation so we can better socially respond to the change.
Maxime, do you want to add anything here? Or?
Maybe a super quick comment. So it seems that Maria's question was about how technological risks were handled in the past and now in the future. I think 2 authors have already wrote about this. I will say that maybe reading Ulrich Beck, Risk Society, and also Charles Perrault, Normal Accidents might be very useful. So that's all.
Thank you. So a question from Lauren Borja, who thought the talks were great. She wanted you to highlight if you had any immediate policy recommendations to address the concerns you raised, anything you haven't brought up so far that you'd like to share. Colin, Daniel, and Maxime, or Colin, Maxime, then Daniel. We'll put Maxime in the middle this time.
I'm going to roll this in with, I see a question from Steve Luby, who's joined us, about what are some of the things that Stanford specifically could do with, connected to the Human-Centered AI Institute. So yeah, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is Stanford could use its institutional capital to pioneer, well, it would be improvement. Stanford could pioneer IRB processes for AI research projects. So right now, as a social scientist who wanted to study AI people making AI, I had to get institutional review board approval to just do interviews, something every social scientist I'm sure is familiar with. But if I were to say, do a project where I scraped the websites of all those same people to gather their personal information and then build a algorithm to predict, you know, their personal traits or something, no ethical review to get funding for that. So that could change very quickly. And as I understand, Fei-Fei Li, the co-director of the HAI, is involved in potentially pioneering a kind of ethical review board. So that would be very exciting. The other thing would be if Stanford, this is the institutional capital part, Stanford could encourage strongly AI conferences and journals to institute a ban on what I would call 19th century AI systems. So this is like, an example would be a very famous, infamous example from Stanford was the gay face algorithm that scraped Tinder profiles to then create a predictive algorithm that would determine with some accuracy whether an individual was homosexual or not. This is 19th century physiognomy being recast in an algorithmic form. And I don't know of any respectable social science conference that would accept a paper like that. And yet the gay face example was just one of actually many, many objectionable algorithms being submitted and accepted at the top AI conferences. So for example, attractiveness as a metric is a whole subfield of study in machine learning. And when you apply an attractiveness style transform to anyone's picture using state-of-the-art techniques, guess what? It transforms your face into a white woman. This is problematic. And I think conferences should just ban this kind of research to try to get the field out of these really questionable areas.
Thanks. Other panelists? Policy recommendations you might have?
I think as an anthropologist and as a scholar, my work is not necessarily to propose policy, but more to force people to think differently about the subject. So it's more about education. I think policy, doing just policy for doing policy as an end to itself is a little bit problematic, especially if it's not going to be enforced. So a lot of policy have been made after Fukushima. None of them are being enforced. So if you can change people's understanding of a subject through education, that might be, for me, a way of doing more concrete change than just doing paper policy that end up being in the drawer of some office with no impact whatsoever.
Daniel?
Yeah, I think that biorisk management is in a position where we are lacking a great deal of data to inform good policy. And so I think that there's sort of a chicken or the egg problem where I think it'd be wise to establish policies that help us to collect data about effective biorisk governance, which would then in turn help us to develop better policies. So one policy recommendation I might make, harking back to my earlier point about better feedback and learning mechanisms for the field, would be for some kind of funding push for philanthropies or for journals to support some kind of review of existing biosecurity and biosafety governance approaches, so that the field can essentially try to learn more about what has worked or what has changed life science practice. I think another policy I would support is better data collection around accidents and near misses in laboratories. We know an amazingly little amount about numbers of accidents, types of accidents, and factors that might create the conditions for accidents. And those inform risk assessment models that all in turn help us make better policy decisions. So I would support a kind of policies that would help us develop better instrumentation, you might say, for data collection in the world of life science risk.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question from Lindsay Kroll, question for Colin. Are you collecting data on the impact of increased screen time among quarantine citizens, including virtual learning among school-age children? If AI will actually lead to a change in human values, then what type of impact might we see as a consequence of our current conditions?
Yeah, great question. No, I am not. I rely on other social scientists to do that kind of work. So the person to follow in this area is Janet Twenge, Twenge, who has several papers that establish pretty conclusively a strong correlation between screen time and increased risk of suicide and depression in teens. And it's pretty shocking. There are some, it's obviously not establishing causation in a strong sense, but it's worrisome given that the drive to prepare young people to work in a future where AI is taking or changing many jobs is to encourage earlier exposure to screens and programming earlier in the primary school process. So that was already happening before COVID-19 lockdown, but as you point out, the lockdown and the shift of all schools, or most all schools, to online classes, is a gigantic social experiment, the likes of which have never been conducted before. And there are actually few, if any, controls to compare against. So it's a ripe place to look. I think telework creates the environment for a lot of AI systems to do quantified self, or quantify the productivity of workers in a more fine-grained way. Because if we're sitting in front of our video screens, this is easily tracked and quantified, and then good fodder for a machine learning algorithm. So it's concerning, and I will be watching.
Thank you. From Jennifer Smith-Hayes, Colin, you discussed the fact that there's no central entity for AI policy. One possible solution to address some of the issues you raised in the 7 domains is ensuring that the federal agencies and private corporations have ethics advisory councils and boards. However, Google canceled theirs a week after forming it last year. What are your thoughts on this, and how should we ensure its implementation?
Yeah, generally I would recommend a move away from a reliance on ethical advisory boards. And I think in this case, a comparison to other epochal or risky, controversial technologies helps kind of highlight in a way something of the absurdity of trying to solve this problem of broad social impact with ethics. Imagine that nuclear engineers said, yep, reactors are dangerous, but we have an ethical advisory board, so we'll get through this. No, you would say, I want a safety engineer, I want a containment vessel, I want guarantees that, meltdown, is not a threat. So AI is different in that there's maybe more uncertainty, more complexity about the effects, but that kind of highlights how hard it is to navigate that with ethics. Because the thing about values is at the universal level, we tend to agree. Sure, fairness, I love it. But then when we get down to specifics, it's human nature to disagree. My fairness is not your fairness, but we're both agreeing we need fairness. So what happens? Disagreement is almost inevitable. And this is one where the strategy of deliberation actually can be used to harness disagreement. So rather than building consensus to some public good or shared vision of what fairness is, I could imagine requiring AI companies like Google, Facebook to run citizen juries or deliberative polls or other forms of what are called mini publics in deliberative democracy theory to explore the space of ethical consequences, potential risks, unintended consequences, dangers. And you can do that with a number of diverse, representative folks without asking anyone to agree up front to some set of principles. Because I think that actually constrains the discussion when you really want as many different views on the problem as possible. And that's something democratic processes are actually pretty good at. So I would look at political decision-making as a model, sometimes our Senate is maybe not the greatest deliberative body, but we've got some good track record there.
Thank you, Colin. We have time for one last question, since I think you already addressed Steve Luby's question. If you give a 1-minute answer to Shasida Ahmed's question, can you provide an example of AI expanding civil liberties?
Expanding liberties, yes. Look, Clearview, the AI system that allows you to do a reverse face lookup that's caused so much controversy lately. You can take a picture of a person on the street and then use it to find their online profile. A toy for the rich before it was released publicly. That expanded liberties, but civil liberties? I would love to see AI designers begin to work on this problem because right now there are many AI systems for expanding one's personal liberty to act on the world, but there's not much I've seen on expanding our ability to act together in the world to be a civic-minded people.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Please joining me in welcoming, thanking Dr. Daniel Greene, Dr. Maxime Polleri, Dr. Colin Garvey for joining us in today's panel. Thank you all for participating.